What if everything we thought we knew about ancient engineering was built on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if the chisels, the hammers, the bronze picks we find in museums, what if they were not the instruments of creation, but merely the tools of maintenance, repair, the implements used by those who came after to fix what they could no longer build themselves? There are places on this earth where stone has been shaped with such precision that the edges meet without mortar, without gap, without even the width of a blade. There are tunnels carved through mountain hearts, corridors that descend into bedrock, foundation stones weighing hundreds of tons, fitted together as if they were clay pressed by patient hands. And yet, when archaeologists examine these surfaces under magnification, under light that reveals every microscopic scratch and indent, they find something deeply unsettling. They find nothing. No tool marks, no percussion rings from hammers, no parallel striations from chisels dragging across stone. Just smooth, flowing surfaces that look less like they were cut and more like they were cast, poured, shaped while soft. If you find yourself drawn to the kind of history that hides in the margin notes of archaeology textbooks, the sort that refuses to fit neatly into timelines, then perhaps you'll join me on this journey. Leave a like if this question stirs something in you. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into the places where accepted history grows quiet and uncomfortable, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight, and what monument near you has always felt too precise, too old, too impossible for the tools we imagined built it. We tell ourselves a story about human history. It goes like this: first came stone, then bronze, then iron. First came crude, then refined. First came simple, then complex. It is a story of linear ascent, of accumulation, of progress marching steadily upward from the caves to the cosmos. And embedded in that story is an assumption so basic we rarely question it. We assume that to shape stone you must strike it. To move stone you must lever and roll it. To cut stone you must abrade it with something harder. We assume that tools, physical instruments of force and friction, are the only pathway from raw material to finished monument. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if there were civilizations that built without striking, shaped without scraping, moved stone without wheels or ramps or the brutality of friction? What if they had another way entirely, and we have spent centuries staring at the evidence, unable to see it because we were looking for the wrong thing? Consider Sacsayhuaman, high in the Peruvian Andes, where stones weighing more than 200 tons interlock with such precision that centuries of earthquakes have not shifted them. The Spanish conquistadors, seeing these walls for the first time, believed they were the work of demons, because no human hand, they thought, could achieve such perfection. When engineers examine these stones today, they find surfaces that undulate, that curve and fold into one another like puzzle pieces designed by a mind that understood three-dimensional geometry at a level we associate with computer modeling. And they find those surfaces smooth, not polished smooth, polished leaves traces, micro-scratches from abrasive material moving in one direction. These are smooth in a way that suggests the stone was soft when it took its final shape, that it flowed into position and then hardened, locking into place with the stone beside it. The official explanation is patience. Bronze or stone tools applied over years, over generations, by hands we will never know. But when archaeologists have attempted to replicate even small sections of these walls using the tools available to the Inca, using the techniques we believe they employed, the results are rough approximations at best. The edges do not meet, the angles drift, and every strike of hammer against stone leaves a mark, a tiny crater of percussion, the signature of force applied. Yet, on the original walls, those signatures are absent. Or consider the granite boxes in the Serapeum of Saqqara, buried beneath the sands of Egypt. These are not tombs, though they are often called that. They are boxes, massive, rectangular containers carved from single blocks of granite and diorite, some of the hardest stones on Earth. The interior dimensions of these boxes are uniform to a tolerance that modern machinists find difficult to achieve. The corners are sharp, true 90-degree angles. The surfaces inside are flat to within thousandths of an inch across spans of several feet. Granite is not a cooperative material. It is a conglomerate of different minerals with different hardness, and when you try to carve it with bronze or even iron, the tool skips and chatters across the variations in density. It leaves a rough, uneven surface. It does not leave the glassy smoothness found inside these boxes. And it certainly does not leave surfaces that are flat to tolerances we associate with precision machinery. The Egyptologists tell us these boxes were made for the burials of sacred bulls, that priests spent years grinding them smooth with sand and patience. But no sand was found inside them. No remains of bulls either. Just emptiness and precision, and the quiet question that hangs in the air when you stand before one. How did they do this? And more unsettling still, why did they need to do it with such impossible accuracy if it was merely a tomb? Across the world, in the highlands of Bolivia, there is a place called Puma Punku. It is often mentioned alongside Tiwanaku, part of the same ancient complex, but Puma Punku has a quality that sets it apart. Here, the stones are not merely fitted, they are modular. H-blocks carved from andesite, a volcanic stone nearly as hard as granite, with channels and grooves cut into them at precise angles, as if they were components of a larger system, pieces of a machine we can no longer recognize. Some of these blocks have been tested by engineers, measured with laser instruments, and found to have tolerances that would be considered acceptable in modern manufacturing. Flat surfaces that deviate by less than a millimeter across their entire span. 90-degree angles that hold true under the scrutiny of digital protractors. Channels cut in parallel with a consistency that suggests a guiding template, a system of replication that produced identical parts. And once again, the surfaces are smooth. No tool marks. No evidence of percussion. Some researchers have pointed to what appear to be drill holes, circular indentations in the stone, and suggested that these prove the use of rotary tools, perhaps tipped with harder stone or early metals. But when those holes are examined closely, they are not quite right. They are too clean. They do not show the spiral striations that a rotating drill would leave as it descends into stone. They look less like the result of drilling and more like the result of a liquid or paste being removed before the stone hardened, leaving a circular void behind. There is a legend among the indigenous people of the Andes, recorded by Spanish chroniclers who dismissed it as primitive superstition. The legend says that in the time before the Inca, there were builders who knew the secret of softening stone. They would apply a plant, sometimes described as a leaf, sometimes as a juice, and the stone would become like clay for a brief time, soft enough to shape by hand, and then it would harden again, stronger than before. The Spanish laughed at this story. Stone does not soften. Stone does not flow. But in the late 20th century, a researcher named Jan Peter de Jong claimed to have witnessed indigenous people in Peru using a plant-based paste to soften small stones, shaping them by hand and allowing them to cure. His claims were met with skepticism, of course. He provided no samples that could be analyzed, no repeatable methodology. And yet, the question lingers. What if there were chemical processes, organic or mineral-based, that could alter the crystalline structure of stone, making it temporarily pliable? What if knowledge of such processes was once widespread and then lost, surviving only as myth? We have a tendency to assume that if we cannot do something with our current technology, then it could not have been done. But there are species of bacteria that can dissolve stone, breaking down minerals over time. There are acids in nature that can etch granite. There are salts and alkalis that, under the right conditions, can alter the surface chemistry of rock. Is it so impossible to imagine that an ancient people, observing these natural processes over centuries, over millennia, might have learned to accelerate them, to control them, to weaponize them not for destruction but for creation? Consider the tunnels beneath Cappadocia in Turkey, descending story after story into the soft volcanic tuff. The official narrative is straightforward. People carved these chambers and corridors using simple hand tools over many generations. But the volume of material removed is staggering. Entire underground cities capable of housing thousands, with ventilation shafts, water channels, storage rooms, and passages so narrow you must crawl through them in the dark. Where did the debris go? Excavating a city's worth of stone produces rubble, mountains of it, and yet there are no corresponding mounds nearby, no dumping sites that match the scale of the excavation. Some researchers have suggested the tunnels were not carved at all, but formed by a process more akin to erosion, to dissolution, to stone being removed chemically rather than mechanically. The walls of these tunnels are smooth, rounded, organic in their flow. They do not look like the result of chiseling. They look like the result of something eating through the rock, methodically, patiently, leaving only the shapes intended behind. And then there are the myths. Not just Andean myths of softened stone, but myths from across the world, separated by oceans and millennia, that speak of similar concepts. In Egypt, there are references in temple inscriptions to the opening of the stone, a ritual phrase that some have interpreted as metaphorical, but that might be more literal than we assume. In Irish legend, there are stones that sing, that respond to sound, that move when the right tone is struck. In Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories, there are accounts of ancestor spirits shaping the land not by striking it, but by singing it into form, by vibrating the substance of the earth until it took the shape they desired. These are dismissed as mythology, as poetic language, as the primitive attempt to explain natural formations. But what if they are memories? Distorted, certainly passed through countless generations of oral tradition, but memories nonetheless of techniques that were once real, once employed, once understood, and then forgotten? Look at the Longyu Caves in China, discovered by accident in 1992 when local villagers decided to pump water from what they thought were natural ponds. What they found instead were enormous chambers carved into solid siltstone, 30 meters deep, covering thousands of square meters, with pillars left standing to support the ceilings and walls that bear intricate patterns of chisel marks. Except when you examine those marks closely, they do not behave as chisel marks should. They are too regular, too consistent, almost like a texture applied uniformly rather than the result of countless individual strikes. And the pillars, why leave pillars at all? If you are removing stone with tools, pillars are an inefficiency, a complication. You must work around them, preserving them as you hollow out everything else. But if the stone were being removed by a dissolving agent, by a chemical or biological process, then pillars would make perfect sense. You would simply protect the areas you want to keep, applying your agent only to the stone you wish to remove, and the pillars would remain untouched as the rest of the chamber is hollowed out around them. There is no written record of who made the Longyu Caves or why. The local historians guessed they were 2,000 years old, but there is no certainty. The chambers were hidden beneath water and earth, lost to memory until a farmer's pump brought them back into the light. And with them came questions that have no satisfying answers. How long would it take to excavate 1,000,000 cubic meters of stone using hand tools? Where is the debris? Why is there no mention of such a massive undertaking in any historical record from the region? And why, if these caves were meant as tombs or temples or storage, are they empty, devoid of artifacts, as if the excavation itself was the purpose, the technique more important than the function? We see this pattern repeated. Precision without explanation, smoothness without tool marks, massive scale without corresponding evidence of labor. And always, in the background, myths that speak of stone behaving in ways stone should not behave, softening, singing, moving, responding to forces other than brute mechanical impact. Now consider the acoustic properties of some of these ancient sites. In the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, sound behaves strangely. Certain frequencies resonate, amplify, linger in the air longer than they should in a simple stone room. In the temples of Malta, in the underground chambers of Hal-Saflieni Hypogeum, there are niches carved at precise locations where a voice speaking in a low frequency will vibrate the entire chamber, a phenomenon that requires not just acoustic knowledge but architectural intentionality. Why build spaces that respond to sound unless sound was part of the construction process itself? There is a field of study, still in its infancy, called acoustic levitation. Under controlled laboratory conditions, sound waves at specific frequencies can suspend small objects in midair, holding them steady against gravity. The objects sit on nodes of pressure, points where the sound wave creates a standing column of force. Scale this up, and theoretically, sound could manipulate larger objects, could vibrate stone at frequencies that reduce friction, that make heavy blocks easier to slide, or, if the frequency is precisely tuned to the resonant frequency of the stone itself, could even cause the molecular structure to loosen temporarily, to become pliable. This is not mainstream science. It is speculative, experimental, the edge of what we understand about sound and matter. But it is not impossible. And it aligns disturbingly well with myths of singing stone, of chants that moved mountains, of priests who knew the tones that would make rock yield. Imagine standing before a massive block of granite, not with a hammer and chisel, but with an instrument that produces sound. You begin to hum or chant or play a note, and you adjust the frequency slowly, carefully, until you feel the stone respond. It is subtle at first, a faint vibration beneath your hand, but as you hold the tone, the vibration builds, the molecules of the granite begin to oscillate in resonance, and for a brief moment, seconds perhaps, maybe less, the stone's rigidity decreases. Not molten, not liquid, but softer, more compliant. And in that moment, you press, you shape, you mold the surface with your hands or with tools that leave no mark because they are not striking, not abrading, merely guiding the stone into the form you desire. Then you release the tone, and the granite hardens again, locking into its new shape, and there is no evidence of what you have done except the impossible precision of the result. Is this what happened? We do not know. We cannot know with certainty because the knowledge, if it existed, was not written down in a form we recognize, or it was written and lost, or it was transmitted orally and died with the last practitioner. But the evidence, the precision, the smoothness, the absence of tool marks, the acoustic properties of ancient sites, the global myths of stone that responds to sound points towards something beyond our current understanding of ancient technology. It suggests a civilization, or perhaps many civilizations, that approached engineering not through force but through resonance, not through mechanical advantage but through an understanding of matter at a level we are only beginning to rediscover. There is a word that appears in ancient Sanskrit texts, in the Vedas and the epics, a word that has troubled translators for generations. Vimana. In modern usage, it means aircraft, and many have seized on this to claim that ancient India had flying machines, that the myths describe literal technology. But if you read the texts carefully, what is described is not always flight. Sometimes it is levitation. Sometimes it is the movement of massive objects without visible means of propulsion. And sometimes, buried in the poetic language, there are references to sound, to mantras, to specific vibrations that could lift stone or make it soft. The texts are metaphorical, yes, they are religious and mythological, and we should not read them as technical manuals. But what if embedded within the metaphor is a memory of actual technique, distorted by time and translation, but real? In the Tibetan text known as the Kanjur, there are references to monks who could move stones by sounding drums and horns at specific intervals. The British explorer and engineer Henry Kjelsen claimed in the early 20th century to have witnessed such a demonstration, describing stones being levitated by coordinated sound from a circle of musicians. His account is unverified, often dismissed as fabrication or misunderstanding, but it is part of a larger tapestry of reports from travelers and missionaries in Tibet and Nepal, speaking of techniques that defied Western understanding. Again, we have no physical evidence, no repeatable experiments, only stories. But the stories persist, and they share a common thread. Sound as a force, vibration as a tool. Modern engineering recognizes the power of resonance. Every structure has a resonant frequency, a specific vibration at which it will begin to shake, to amplify the energy it receives. This is why soldiers break step when crossing bridges. This is why opera singers, in theory, can shatter glass. Hit the right frequency with enough amplitude, and rigid materials become unstable. Now imagine that instead of shattering, you could find a frequency that makes stone pliable, that disrupts the bonds between molecules just enough to allow shaping. It would require immense precision, knowledge of the material, knowledge of acoustics, but it is not physically impossible. It is merely unknown, unproven, outside the bounds of what we currently practice. There is another possibility, one that moves away from acoustics and toward chemistry. Geopolymer theory suggests that some of the stones we think are carved might actually be ancient concrete, a mixture of crushed stone and mineral binders that could be poured into molds and allowed to harden. This would explain the precision, the lack of tool marks, the modular nature of some blocks. But it does not explain everything. Geopolymer concrete, when examined under a microscope, shows a distinct structure, a binding matrix that is absent in many of the stones in question. The granite of the Serapeum boxes, the andesite of Pumapunku, the limestone of the Great Pyramid's core. These are natural stones, not cast. Their mineral grains are interlocked in ways that form over millions of years under immense geological pressure. They are not artificial, and yet they have been shaped with a precision that suggests they were soft at some point. What if there is a middle ground? What if there were techniques to temporarily alter the surface chemistry of natural stone, making the outer layer soft enough to shape while the core remains solid? There are experiments in materials science today that use focused electromagnetic fields to alter the properties of metals, making them easier to work for brief periods. There are chemical treatments that can etch stone in controlled ways. These are modern innovations, but the principles that matter can be manipulated at the molecular level, that rigidity is not absolute, are universal. Is it so far-fetched to imagine that an ancient people, observing the natural world closely, might have discovered similar principles and applied them in ways we have yet to rediscover? Consider the Inca walls again, but this time consider the stories told by the people who live beside them. They say their ancestors had a small bird whose beak secreted a substance that could soften stone. The builders would capture these birds, collect the secretion, and apply it to the stone they wished to shape. Modern biologists dismiss this as folklore. No known bird has such a secretion, but we have discovered, in recent decades, species of lichen and bacteria that can break down rock, that excrete acids and enzymes as part of their metabolic process. We have found that certain plants concentrate minerals in ways that create caustic compounds in their sap. Nature is a chemist far more inventive than we are, working over spans of time we can barely comprehend. Is it impossible that a culture closely attuned to the natural world might have discovered a biological agent capable of softening stone? And if such an agent existed, and the species that produced it went extinct, or the knowledge of how to culture and use it was lost, would we not be left exactly where we are, staring at the results, unable to replicate them, explaining them away as the product of endless patience and primitive tools? The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. This is a principle we accept in archaeology when it suits us, when we need to explain gaps in the record. But when the evidence that is absent is tool marks, when what we do not find is the expected detritus of construction, when the precision exceeds what we can achieve with the tools we assume were used, we become uncomfortable. We invent explanations, patience, lost techniques with familiar tools, sheer human determination. But these explanations require us to believe that ancient peoples were willing to invest lifetimes, generations, into projects with tolerances that exceed function, that serve no practical purpose beyond perfection itself. Perhaps that is the answer. Perhaps the precision was not accidental, not merely the byproduct of available techniques, but intentional, a demonstration of mastery, a statement carved into stone that says, "We understood this material at a level you have yet to reach." If that is the case, then the question becomes, what else did they understand that we have lost? In Japan, in the forests of Yakushima, there are stones known as the Yonaguni Monument, submerged structures off the coast that some argue are natural geological formations and others insist are the ruins of a lost civilization. Among the features are flat surfaces, right angles, and what appear to be carved channels, all beneath the ocean, dated to a time when sea levels were lower, when the land was above water. The debate rages, natural versus artificial, but what is often overlooked in the debate are the tool marks, or again, the lack thereof. The surfaces where they are flat are smooth. The angles where they are sharp are clean. If these are artificial, they were made with techniques that left no trace of their application. If they are natural, then nature has a sense of geometry we do not usually attribute to it. Or consider Easter Island, the Moai statues that stare out over the Pacific. These are well documented, their construction understood to a reasonable degree, stone tools, ramps, ropes, coordination of labor over years. But at the quarry, Reino Raraku, there are moai that were never finished, abandoned in various stages of completion, and among them are some that seem to have been carved directly out of the living rock, emerging from the mountainside as if they were always there, waiting to be revealed. The surfaces of these partial statues are smooth, the features defined with a softness that seems at odds with the hardness of volcanic tuff. And again, the tool marks, while present, are inconsistent with the surfaces they supposedly produced. The marks are there, yes, but they are shallow, superficial, as if they were added after the primary shaping was complete, as if they were decoration or deliberately placed to suggest a process that was not the actual process. This pattern, tool marks that do not match the result, precision that exceeds the capability of known tools, smoothness where roughness should be, is global. It spans cultures that had no contact, or at least no contact we can prove. It appears in Egypt and Peru, in Bolivia and India, in China and Turkey. And it is always accompanied by silence. No texts that explain the technique. No tools that demonstrate the method. Only the finished work and the myths, and the uncomfortable realization that we might be missing something fundamental about how these structures were made. There is a concept in epistemology called the unknown unknown. The idea that there are things we do not know, gaps in our understanding so complete that we do not even recognize them as gaps. For most of human history, we did not know about bacteria, about radiation, about electromagnetic fields. These forces were acting on us, shaping our world, but we were blind to them because we lacked the framework to perceive them. Is it possible that there are forces, techniques, principles of material science that ancient peoples understood and we do not because we are less intelligent, but because we have taken a different path, developed different technologies, and in doing so, closed off avenues of exploration that they kept open? Modern engineering is based on mechanical advantage. We use machines to amplify force, to cut and grind and shape through the application of energy. We have become very good at this. We can carve stone with diamond-tipped saws, with water jets, with lasers that vaporize material atom by atom. But all of these methods leave marks, signatures of the process. Even a laser, which does not touch the material it cuts, leaves a heat-affected zone, a change in the surface structure. If ancient engineers were achieving similar results through different means, through chemistry, through acoustics, through techniques we have not imagined, then we would expect exactly what we see. Results that mimic precision cutting but without the marks of cutting, surfaces that appear molded but are clearly natural stone. The question, then, is not whether ancient peoples were as intelligent as we are. Of course they were. The question is whether intelligence, applied over generations without the interruptions of collapse and dark ages, without the need to reinvent lost knowledge, might reach conclusions and develop techniques that parallel our own in outcome but differ entirely in method. And if such techniques existed and were then lost through disaster, through conquest, through the simple fact that they required specific knowledge passed master to apprentice and the chain was broken, what would remain? Only the structures, only the myths, only the silence of stone that has forgotten how it was shaped. We stand before these monuments today with laser levels and electron microscopes, with all the tools of modern analysis, and we measure them and we marvel and we cannot quite believe what we are seeing. So we tell ourselves it must have been patience. It must have been time. It must have been thousands of workers with copper chisels and stone pounders, working for decades, for lifetimes, achieving through sheer persistence what we achieve through technology. And perhaps that is true. Perhaps human determination, given enough time, can accomplish anything. But there is another possibility, one that requires us to accept that our understanding of ancient technology is incomplete, that there are chapters missing from the story we tell about human progress. And that possibility is simply this: they had another way. Let us turn our attention to a detail that is easy to overlook. Feature so subtle that it requires not just observation but a willingness to see what should not be there. In the stone blocks of Ollantaytambo, another Incan site in Peru, there are sections where the stone appears to have flowed, to have rippled like water before hardening. The effect is similar to what you might see in cooled lava, where the surface has frozen mid-movement, capturing the liquid motion in solid form. Geologists who have examined these formations confirm that the stone is not volcanic, not basalt or obsidian that flowed naturally as magma. It is andesite, diorite, limestone, stones that form deep underground under pressure, stones that do not flow, that have never been liquid in their current form. And yet, the ripples are there, undeniable, carved into the surface in a way that suggests the surface was not carved at all but was soft, was pliable, was moved by something, pressure, vibration, manipulation, before it locked into its final state. This is where we reach the edge of conventional explanation. We can accept that ancient peoples were skilled, that they understood their materials, that they had patience we can scarcely imagine. But patience does not make stone flow. Skill does not create ripples in granite. These effects require that the stone was, at some point, not behaving as stone should behave. And that brings us back to the central question: what if they had techniques we have lost, techniques that altered the fundamental properties of the material they were working with? In medieval alchemy, there are references to the philosopher's stone, a substance that could transform base metals into gold, but also, in some texts, a substance that could soften and shape any material. Alchemy is dismissed as proto-science, as the misguided precursor to chemistry, and much of it was certainly metaphorical, spiritual, not literal. But alchemists were also practical experimenters, working with acids and bases, with salts and minerals, observing reactions and recording results. Is it possible that buried in the allegorical language of alchemical texts are descriptions of real chemical processes, processes that could alter stone? We do not know because we do not read those texts as chemistry. We read them as history of science, as curiosities, as the dead ends of human inquiry. But what if some of those dead ends led somewhere, and we simply stopped looking? There is a researcher named Christopher Dunn, a precision engineer who has spent decades studying the Great Pyramid and other ancient Egyptian sites. His conclusion, based on measurements and analysis, is that some of the stonework could only have been achieved with machine tools, with saws and drills that used abrasive or cutting elements far harder than bronze. He has proposed that the ancient Egyptians had access to advanced technology, perhaps not electrical or mechanical in the way we understand it, but advanced nonetheless, capable of precision we associate with modern manufacturing. His work is controversial, often dismissed by mainstream archaeology as fringe, but his measurements are sound, his engineering analysis rigorous. He is not claiming aliens or lost continents. He is simply saying, the precision is here, it is measurable, and it exceeds what we think is possible with the tools we believe they had. Therefore, our beliefs about their tools must be incomplete. This is a reasonable position, a scientific position, but it forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. That there are technologies in our past that we have no record of, no artifacts of, no evidence for except the work they produced. And if such technologies existed, what were they? How did they function? And why were they lost? One possibility is that these technologies were not technologies in the sense we understand the term. They were not machines with moving parts, not devices that could break down and leave rusted remains for archaeologists to find. They were processes, knowledge-based techniques that required understanding but not equipment, or equipment so simple, so organic, that it decomposed entirely, leaving nothing behind. Paste made from plants, a mixture of minerals, a sequence of sounds. These would leave no trace except in the results they produced and the myths they inspired. Another possibility is that the knowledge was deliberately guarded, restricted to a small group of specialists who passed it down through initiation, through oral teaching, through demonstration. If that lineage was broken by invasion, by disease, by social collapse, the knowledge would vanish in a single generation. We have seen this happen in recorded history. The Greek fire of Byzantium, a weapon that burned on water, was lost when the empire fell. The recipe for Damascus steel, blades of legendary sharpness and flexibility, was lost when the trade routes that supplied the raw materials were disrupted. The technique for creating Roman concrete, which has lasted 2,000 years and which modern concrete cannot match, was lost in the chaos of the empire's decline. If knowledge can be lost in civilizations with writing, with libraries, with extensive records, how much more easily could it be lost in civilizations that relied on oral transmission, on the master teaching the apprentice, on hands passing knowledge to hands? And so we are left with monuments we cannot fully explain, techniques we cannot replicate, and a story about the past that has gaps in it, places where the narrative stumbles and grows vague. We fill those gaps with assumptions, bronze tools, patience, human labor, and most of the time those assumptions are sufficient. But sometimes, when the precision is too great, the scale too vast, the evidence too contradictory, the assumptions fail. And in those moments, we have a choice. We can insist that the assumptions must be correct, that any alternative is speculation, fringe thinking, unscientific. Or we can allow ourselves to consider that the past might be stranger than we thought, that human ingenuity might have taken paths we have not traveled, and that the monuments our ancestors left behind might be messages we have not yet learned to read. There is a site in Baalbek, Lebanon, where the ruins of a Roman temple stand on a foundation that predates Rome by centuries, perhaps millennia. The foundation is made of stones, the largest of which are called the trilithon, 3 massive blocks, each weighing an estimated 800 to 1,000 tons. They are fitted together so precisely that a sheet of paper cannot be inserted between them. Above them are smaller stones, still enormous by any standard, but clearly part of a different construction phase, rougher, less precise. And in the quarry nearby, there is a fourth block, even larger, known as the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing perhaps 1,200 tons, cut and ready to move but never transported, abandoned where it was shaped, as if the project was interrupted and never resumed. How do you move a 1,000-ton stone? Modern cranes can lift such weights, but barely, and only with careful planning, with stable ground, with infrastructure. There are no cranes in the archaeological record of Baalbek's construction. There are no ramps large enough, no evidence of rollers or sledges that could bear the weight. The Roman historian Pliny mentioned the stones, called them a wonder, but provided no explanation for how they were placed. Later historians speculated wildly, giants, demons, alien intervention, but these are not explanations. They are admissions of ignorance dressed as myth. If the stones were not moved by mechanical force, then they were moved by some other means. And if they were not cut with tools, then they were shaped by some other process. The surface of the trilithon blocks, where it can be examined, is smooth, dressed, finished. There are no drag marks from sledges, no wear patterns from ropes or levers. They appear, impossibly, to have been placed with precision, lowered into position without damage, without the scraping and grinding that massive weight would inevitably. 'Cause if moved by sliding or rolling, could sound have moved them? Could vibration at the right frequency have reduced the friction between stone and earth, made the blocks effectively lighter, easier to manipulate? There are no experiments at this scale, no modern tests that could confirm or deny this, because no one has the resources or the willingness to vibrate a 1,000-ton stone and see what happens. But the principle exists in smaller forms. Ultrasonic vibration is used in manufacturing to reduce friction during metal forming. Acoustic levitation, as mentioned before, can suspend small objects in air. Scale is the barrier, but scale is a problem of energy, of amplitude, and if a culture had generations to refine the technique, to build instruments capable of producing the necessary sound, it is not outside the realm of physical possibility. Or consider again the chemical approach. What if the stones were not moved in their current state but were carved at the quarry, then broken down chemically into smaller, transportable pieces, moved to the site and reconstituted, fused back together using the same process that softened them? This would explain the precision of the joints, the absence of mortar, the seamless fit. It would also explain why the stones appear monolithic. They are monolithic, but they were not always so. This is pure speculation, of course, unsupported by any direct evidence, but it is an attempt to solve a problem that has no other solution within the boundaries of known ancient technology. The deeper we go into this question, the more we realize that we are not arguing about evidence. The evidence is clear. The stones are there, precisely fitted, impossibly large, shaped without tool marks. What we are arguing about is interpretation, about which explanations we are willing to consider. Mainstream archaeology insists that the explanations must fit within the framework of known tools and techniques, even if that means accepting timescales and labor forces that strain credibility. Alternative researchers argue that the framework itself is incomplete, that we should allow for the possibility of techniques we have not imagined. Both sides are working from the same evidence, but they are asking different questions. One asks, how could they have done this with what we think they had? The other asks, what must they have had to do this? There is a third question, one that neither side asks often enough. Why? Why build with such precision? Why move stones so large that moving them becomes the primary challenge? Why create monuments that will outlast your civilization by thousands of years, that will stand as enigmas to every generation that comes after? The usual answers, religious devotion, political power, a desire for immortality, are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They explain the motivation to build, but not the motivation to build in this specific way, to push the boundaries of material and technique to the point where the construction itself becomes a mystery. Unless the mystery was the point, unless the builders intended to leave something behind that could not be easily explained, that would force future generations to confront the limits of their understanding. Unless the monuments are not just structures but messages, and the message is, you do not know as much as you think you know. Look at what we did. Try to explain it. And when you cannot, consider that your framework might be missing something essential. This is a humbling thought, and humility is not a quality we associate with modern technological civilization. We tend to believe that we are at the pinnacle of human achievement, that our ancestors were less capable, less knowledgeable, that progress is linear and always upward. But the monuments disagree. They stand there, silent and precise, built with techniques we cannot replicate, and they suggest that the arc of human knowledge is not a straight line but a circle or perhaps a spiral, where knowledge is gained and lost and gained again, where civilizations rise and fall, and each time something is forgotten. Let us consider what happens when stone is struck, when force is applied in the way we assume ancient builders applied it. Stone fractures along planes of weakness, along the grain lines, the crystal boundaries. This is predictable, exploitable, the basis of stone carving. A skilled mason learns to read the stone, to find the lines where it wants to break, and to work with those lines, guiding the fracture, controlling it. But this process leaves evidence. Every strike of a chisel creates a cone of percussion, a small crater where the impact occurred. Every pass of a saw leaves parallel grooves, striations from the abrasive cutting through the material. Every drill creates a round hole with spiral marks from the rotation. This is the signature of mechanical stone working, and it is consistent, identifiable, present in every culture that has worked stone with tools. But in the examples we have been discussing, these signatures are absent, or they are present in ways that do not match the finished surface. In some cases, tool marks are visible on rough, unfinished sections, but the finished surfaces are smooth, as if a different process was used for the final shaping. This has led some researchers to propose a two-stage process. Rough shaping with traditional tools, then final finishing with something else, something that leaves no mark. But what could that something be? Polishing with sand and water can smooth a surface, but it leaves micro-scratches, it rounds edges, it does not create the sharp, true angles seen in places like Puma Punku. Grinding with abrasive stones has the same limitations. It can refine but not perfect, and it certainly cannot achieve the tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter across spans of meters. There is a technique used in modern precision manufacturing called lapping, where a surface is ground against another surface with a fine abrasive paste between them, repeatedly, until both surfaces become perfectly flat, mirrors of each other. This can achieve extraordinary precision, but it requires a reference surface, something already flat to work against, and it is a slow, iterative process. For ancient builders to use lapping, they would have needed reference surfaces of corresponding size, tools and techniques passed down through generations, and a cultural commitment to precision for its own sake. Is this possible? Yes. Is it likely? That depends on how much weight you give to the difficulty of the process versus the evidence of the result. But there is another detail that complicates the lapping explanation. In the Serapeum boxes, the interior surfaces are not just flat, they are concave in some sections, gently curved in 3 dimensions. Lapping can create flat surfaces but not controlled curves unless the reference surface is also curved, and creating a curved reference surface with the same precision is a circular problem, a loop of requiring precision to create precision. At some point, there must be an initial method, a way to establish the first true surface, and that method, whatever it was, leaves no trace. What if the initial method was not subtractive but formative? What if the stone was shaped not by removing material but by arranging it while it was soft, then allowing it to harden into the desired form? This returns us to the idea of softening, of altering the stone's state temporarily. And while this idea is unsettling, while it challenges our understanding of what stone is and how it behaves, it is not incompatible with what we know about materials in general. Phase changes, solid to liquid to gas, are fundamental to matter. We know that pressure and temperature can force these changes. We know that chemical reactions can alter molecular structures. We know that all matter is, at a fundamental level, atoms held together by forces, and those forces can be manipulated. The question is whether ancient peoples discovered ways to manipulate those forces using the resources available to them. Consider glass. To someone who has never seen glass made, it would seem like magic. Sand, heated to the point where it melts, then cooled into a transparent solid. The transformation is dramatic, the result seemingly unrelated to the starting material. But once you know the process, it is simple, repeatable, understandable. Is it possible that there are similar processes for stone, transformations that seem impossible until you know the trick, and then become obvious? And if such processes existed and the knowledge was lost, would we not be in exactly the position we are in now? staring at the results, unable to reproduce them, forced to theorize about patience and primitive tools because we have no other framework to work within. The ruins at Tiwanaku, adjacent to Puma Punku, include a structure called the Gateway of the Sun, a single block of andesite carved with intricate designs, images of a deity surrounded by geometric patterns and figures. The carving is deep, precise, the lines crisp and even. But andesite is a hard stone, one of the hardest, and carving it to this level of detail with bronze or stone tools would be extraordinarily difficult. Modern attempts to replicate the gateway using both ancient and modern tools have failed to match the original in precision or detail. The replicas are rough approximations, recognizable but lacking the refinement, the sharpness, the sense that every line was placed with intention and certainty. This pattern, originals that surpass attempts at replication, is common throughout ancient sites. We can come close, but we cannot match. And that gap between what we can do and what they did is where the mystery lives. Some will say that the gap proves only that we have not tried hard enough, that with enough time and dedication we could replicate anything. But time and dedication are themselves assumptions about how the original was made. If the original was made using a different method, then time and dedication with the wrong method will never close the gap. It is like trying to paint the Mona Lisa using only charcoal. You can spend a lifetime on it, achieve something impressive, but it will never be the same because the medium is wrong. There is a tendency, when confronted with something we cannot explain, to reach for the extraordinary, to invoke lost continents, advanced ancient civilizations with technology matching or exceeding our own, visitors from other worlds. These explanations are appealing because they resolve the mystery, they provide an answer, even if the answer is unfalsifiable, unprovable, more myth than theory. But they are not necessary. We do not need Atlantis or extraterrestrials to explain precision stonework. We need only accept that human beings, observing the world closely, experimenting patiently, passing knowledge through generations, might discover things we have not discovered, might take paths we have not taken. Consider the knowledge encoded in traditional practices around the world, knowledge that seems simple but is the result of centuries of observation. Indigenous peoples in the Amazon know which plants are medicinal, which are poisonous, which can be combined to neutralize toxins. They did not learn this through written science. They learned it through trial and error, through careful observation, through oral transmission. And some of that knowledge is so specific, so complex, that Western scientists, armed with laboratories and analytical tools, have only recently begun to understand how it works. The people who used these plants did not need to understand the biochemistry. They needed only to know that it worked and to remember. Could knowledge of stone softening or acoustic manipulation or chemical shaping exist in the same way? Not as written formulas but as practice, as technique, as something you learn by doing under the guidance of someone who knows. And if that practice was disrupted, if the teachers died before passing it on, if the materials became unavailable or the social structures that supported the knowledge collapsed, would the knowledge survive? Probably not. It would fade into myth, into stories of ancestors who could do things we can no longer do, who had secrets we have lost. This is not speculative. This is how knowledge works in oral cultures, and for most of human history, most cultures were oral. Writing is a recent invention, and even after its invention, it was reserved for records, for administration, for religion. Technical knowledge, craft knowledge, the hands-on understanding of how to make and build, was still transmitted by demonstration, by apprenticeship. And when those chains of transmission broke, the knowledge vanished. We know this happened with specific crafts. We know the Romans could make concrete that self-heals, that gains strength over time, and we do not know how. We know medieval builders could construct cathedrals with stone vaults that defy simple structural analysis, and while we can measure the forces and understand the result, we cannot always explain the design process, the intuition that guided the builders. We know that samurai swords were forged using techniques that modern metallurgists struggle to replicate, even with electron microscopes and spectroscopy. These are all examples from literate civilizations, societies with writing, with records. How much more knowledge has been lost from pre-literate societies, from cultures that left no texts, only stones. The stones are what remain, and they speak if we are willing to listen, not with words but with precision, with anomalies, with qualities that should not be there if they were made the way we think they were made. They tell us that the people who shaped them knew something, had some technique, some understanding that we do not have. We can dismiss this message. We can insist that the stones lie, that they only appear impossible, that with enough time and patience, anything is possible. Or we can take the stones seriously, treat them as evidence of capability, and ask what capabilities would be required to produce this evidence. This is not an argument for ancient supercivilizations. It is an argument for humility, for recognizing that intelligence and ingenuity are not the exclusive property of the modern world. It is an argument for the possibility that human knowledge is not cumulative in a simple sense, that we do not merely build on what came before, but that we also lose, forget, abandon paths that might have led somewhere valuable. And it is an argument that the absence of artifacts, the absence of tools, is not proof that the tools did not exist, but might be proof only that the tools were perishable or were not tools in the sense we recognize. Think about the technologies we rely on that leave almost no trace. Software is written, used, becomes obsolete, and disappears. The knowledge of how to write it remains in a few minds, then fades as those minds turn to newer problems. In 1,000 years, if our civilization collapsed, what evidence of software would remain? The computers would corrode. The data storage would degrade. The languages, the algorithms, the entire edifice of digital technology might leave no physical trace, only the effects it had on society, on infrastructure, on the shape of the world. An archaeologist digging through our ruins might find buildings whose design makes no sense without the assumption of electricity, of lighting, of climate control, but would not find the tools that made those buildings possible, because the tools are not physical objects but knowledge, encoded in minds and in texts that will not survive. If an ancient civilization had techniques based on biological materials, on acoustic knowledge, on chemical processes using plant extracts or mineral mixtures that leave no residue, then the only trace would be the work itself. The monuments, the precision, the mystery, and maybe that is enough. Maybe the monuments are the message, and the message is not look how great we were, but look how much is possible. Maybe they are an invitation to remember that stone is not inert, that matter is not fixed, that the world is more malleable than it seems if you know where to apply pressure, or sound, or patience. Maybe they are a reminder that the path to mastery is not always through force, but sometimes through understanding, through working with the material instead of against it. The Inca, who built on the earlier work of cultures whose names we do not know, had a word, Pachacuti. It means upheaval, the overturning of space and time, the moment when the world ends and begins again. They believed history was cyclical, that civilizations rose and fell in great ages, and that each age inherited fragments from the one before, fragments that were sometimes misunderstood, sometimes revered, but always incomplete. When they found the massive stones at Sacsayhuaman, they did not claim to have built them. They said the stones were there before, placed by the ancestors, by people whose names had been lost to time. And they built upon those stones, adding their own layers, their own constructions, but they did not pretend to have the knowledge that shaped the original foundation. This is a pattern we see around the world. Later cultures building on earlier ruins, reusing stones, incorporating older structures into new ones, sometimes with reverence, sometimes with indifference, but always with an implicit acknowledgement that the older work was different, perhaps better, certainly more mysterious. The Greeks did this, building on Mycenaean and earlier Neolithic foundations. The Egyptians did this, with Old Kingdom temples repaired and expanded by later dynasties using techniques that could not match the original precision. The Christians and Muslims did this, converting Roman and Byzantine structures, adding new elements but leaving the bones of the older buildings intact because they were too solid, too well made to tear down. This suggests a long timeline of human civilization, not the neat 6,000 years from the first cities to now, but something older, with rises and falls that are not recorded, that left no texts, only stones. And if those older phases developed techniques that were lost in the collapses, then we would expect exactly what we see: foundations of incredible precision beneath layers of cruder construction, myths of lost abilities, and a persistent sense in many cultures that the ancestors were greater, that we are living in a diminished age trying to recapture what was once known. The dominant narrative of history resists this. It insists on progress, on the idea that we are the pinnacle, that everything before us was primitive. But the stones resist this narrative. They do not fit. They are too precise, too massive, too well made to be the work of people with copper chisels and wooden mallets. And so we are forced to choose. Do we trust the narrative, or do we trust the stones? If we trust the stones, then we must accept that there are chapters of human history we do not understand, techniques we have not recovered, knowledge that was lost. This does not require mysticism. It does not require intervention from outside. It requires only the acknowledgement that human beings are capable of brilliance, and that brilliance does not always follow the same path. It requires accepting that engineering solutions are not unique, that there are many ways to solve the problem of shaping stone, and that some of those ways might leave no tool marks, no mechanical evidence, only the result. We are beginning, in the 21st century, to explore some of these alternative pathways. Researchers are experimenting with acoustic levitation, with ultrasonic cutting, with chemical etching using biological agents. These are emerging technologies, cutting-edge research, but the principles are not new. The principles are inherent in the physics of matter, in the chemistry of minerals, in the biology of organisms that interact with stone. If we are discovering these principles now, is it impossible that others discovered them before, worked with them for generations, refined them to a high art, and then lost them when the social structures that supported that art collapsed? The archaeological record is full of discontinuities, places where complex societies vanish, where cities are abandoned, where knowledge is lost. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw the fall of multiple civilizations in the Mediterranean, a cascade of failures that erased centuries of accumulated knowledge. The fall of Rome led to a dark age in Europe where literacy plummeted, where architectural techniques were forgotten, where the ability to maintain infrastructure decayed. The Maya collapse left cities swallowed by jungle, their inscriptions unread for centuries. These are examples from relatively recent history, from literate societies. How many collapses occurred before writing, before recorded history, and what knowledge died with them? If a civilization possessed techniques for shaping stone without conventional tools, techniques that required specific knowledge, specific materials, specific training, and that civilization collapsed, whether through climate change, through war, through disease, through the exhaustion of critical resources, would the techniques survive? Probably not. The people who knew them would die. The apprentices would not be trained. The next generation would look at the old monuments, marvel at them, and invent stories to explain them, stories of giants or gods or demons, because the real explanation, that their grandparents knew something they did not, would be too painful to accept. This is the cycle of forgetting. And it is possible that we are living in a forgetting, that the monuments around us are not the products of primitive ancestors but the remnants of sophisticated ones, people who approach technology differently, who understood material science in ways we are only beginning to rediscover. If this is true, then the challenge before us is not to explain how they did it with the tools we think they had, but to learn what they knew, to recover the knowledge that was lost. We may never fully succeed. The knowledge may be too fragmented, the clues too subtle, the techniques too dependent on materials or conditions that no longer exist. But the attempt itself is valuable, because it forces us to question our assumptions, to look at the world with fresh eyes, to consider that the past is not a settled question but an ongoing mystery, and that every stone, every monument, every artifact is a piece of a puzzle we have not yet solved. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the quarry in Aswan, Egypt, where the unfinished obelisk lies, still attached to the bedrock. This obelisk, if it had been completed, would have weighed over 1,000 tons, the largest single piece of stone ever shaped by human hands. It was abandoned due to a crack, a flaw in the granite that made it unsuitable, but the work that was done before the flaw was discovered tells us something about the process. Around the obelisk, there are channels, trenches cut into the bedrock, and the official explanation is that workers pounded the granite with dolerite hammers, stones harder than granite, striking over and over until the stone fractured and could be removed in pieces. This explanation has been tested. Experimental archaeologists have taken dolerite hammers and attempted to replicate the work. It is possible. You can, with enough time and effort, pound granite with dolerite and create a trench. But the process is slow, exhausting, and it leaves a rough surface, a battered, fractured texture that does not match the relatively smooth channels around the unfinished obelisk. And it destroys the dolerite hammers. They chip, they crack, they wear down, and you need many of them to make even modest progress. Where are the broken hammers? Some have been found, yes, but not in quantities that match the volume of stone removed. And the channels themselves, when examined, do not show the battering that this process should produce. They are too smooth, too even, too controlled. So we are back to the same question. If not by pounding, then how? And the answer might be that we are asking the wrong question. We are asking how, in terms of mechanical force, in terms of tools and impact, when the answer might lie in a different domain entirely: chemistry, biology, acoustics, fields where the evidence of the process is not physical marks but change in the material itself. There is an anecdote, possibly apocryphal, about a group of researchers in the 1950s who traveled to Tibet and claimed to have seen monks levitating stones using sound, using drums and trumpets positioned in a specific geometric pattern around the stone, playing a coordinated sequence of notes. The story has been repeated, embellished, questioned, and ultimately dismissed by mainstream science because there are no photographs, no recordings, no physical evidence beyond the testimony of people whose credibility is questioned because they made an extraordinary claim. But let us not dismiss it out of hand. Let us ask, if this were possible, what would it require? It would require an understanding of resonance, of the frequencies at which stone vibrates. It would require instruments capable of producing those frequencies at sufficient amplitude. It would require coordination, multiple sources of sound phased correctly so that they reinforce rather than cancel each other. And it would require knowledge passed down through generations of exactly how to do this, which tones, which rhythms, which patterns. This is not simple, but it is not physically impossible. Sound is pressure, pressure is force, and force can move objects. The question is one of scale, of precision, of whether humans without electronic instruments could achieve the necessary control. We do not know. We have not tried. And perhaps that is the problem. We have not tried because the idea seems fantastical, because it comes to us wrapped in stories of monks and mysteries, and we dismiss the stories without testing the underlying principle. We do the same with chemical softening, with biological agents, with any technique that falls outside the narrow band of methods we consider plausible. We say, show us the evidence. But we do not look for the evidence in the right places, because we have already decided what is possible and what is not. This is not science. Science is the process of testing hypotheses, of being willing to be wrong, of following the evidence wherever it leads. But in archaeology, in the study of ancient technology, we often practice something closer to orthodoxy, a defense of established narratives against challenges, a tendency to fit evidence into existing frameworks rather than allowing evidence to reshape the frameworks. There is a growing movement within archaeology called experimental archaeology, where researchers attempt to replicate ancient techniques using period-appropriate materials and methods. This is valuable work. It has taught us much about how things were made, about the challenges ancient people faced, about the ingenuity they employed. But it has limits. If the original technique was one we do not know, one we have not imagined, then our experiments will fail to replicate the original, and we will conclude that the original was harder, took longer, required more labor, when in fact it might have been easier, faster, more elegant, using a method we simply have not tried. This is the trap of assumption. We assume ancient peoples had limited knowledge, limited technology, and so we interpret their achievements in terms of brute force and endless labor. But what if they were not limited in the ways we think? What if they had different knowledge, different technologies, specialized and refined over centuries for specific purposes? What if the path to shaping stone without tool marks was not through harder tools but through no tools at all, through direct manipulation of the material using forces and processes we have only recently begun to understand? The answer is that we do not know, and we may never know with certainty. But the absence of certainty is not permission to close the question. It is an invitation to remain curious, to keep looking, to accept that the past is not fully known, and that the monuments our ancestors left behind might still have secrets to teach us. They are not just relics. They are not just tourist attractions or subjects for academic papers. They are evidence, physical and undeniable, that human beings once did things we cannot easily explain. And until we can explain them, until we can stand before the trilithon of Baalbek or the boxes of the Serapeum or the walls of Sacsayhuaman and say with confidence, this is how it was done. We must remain humble, remain open, remain willing to consider that the answer might be something we have not yet imagined. There is a quality to these ancient sites that goes beyond the physical, a presence that visitors often remark upon, a sense that the stones are watching, waiting, holding something back. This is subjective, of course, not measurable, not scientific, but it is persistent enough that it deserves acknowledgement. People who stand before these monuments feel small, feel the weight of time, feel a connection to something larger than themselves. Part of this is scale, massive stones, ancient origins, the sheer audacity of the construction. But part of it might be something else, something embedded in the precision itself, in the knowledge that what stands before you should not be possible, and yet it is. This sense of the impossible made real is unsettling. It challenges our place in history, our assumption that we are the culmination of progress. It suggests that we might be in the middle or even in a decline, that the arc of human capability has peaks and valleys, and that we might be climbing out of a valley, rediscovering abilities that were once common and then lost. This is a theme in many ancient cultures, the idea of cyclical history, of ages of gold and silver and bronze and iron, each lesser than the last, until the cycle resets and begins again. We dismiss this as mythology, as metaphor, but what if it is memory? What if civilizations have risen and fallen before, and each time, some knowledge is preserved and some is lost, and we are the inheritors of fragments, trying to piece together a whole that we cannot see? The Vedic texts speak of yugas, vast cycles of time, ages lasting hundreds of thousands of years. The Maya had their long count calendar, cycles within cycles, marking epochs of creation and destruction. The Greeks had their ages, ruled by different gods, each ending in catastrophe. These are not isolated beliefs. They are a pattern, a recurring theme across cultures that had no contact, and the theme is always the same. Time is not linear, history repeats, and what comes after is not always greater than what came before. If we take these myths seriously, not as literal history but as distorted memory, then the question of lost techniques, of knowledge forgotten, becomes not just plausible but expected. We would expect to find monuments we cannot explain, because they were built in a different age by people with different knowledge. We would expect the techniques to be lost, because the collapse that ended that age would have disrupted the transmission of knowledge. And we would expect the survivors to look at the old monuments, marvel at them, and invent stories of gods and giants, because the alternative, that their ancestors were more capable than they are, would be too painful to accept without a narrative frame that makes it bearable. This is speculation, yes, but it is speculation grounded in observation, in the patterns we see in history, in the myths, in the monuments themselves. And it offers a framework for understanding why we find what we find. Precision without tool marks, massive stones moved without mechanical evidence, global myths of lost abilities. It suggests that the answer to how did they do it might be we don't know because they knew things we don't know, and that this is not an evasion but an honest assessment of the evidence. What would it take to recover that knowledge? Would require interdisciplinary work, bringing together archaeologists, engineers, material scientists, acousticians, chemists, biologists, all working together to test hypotheses that fall outside traditional frameworks. It would require funding, institutional support, a willingness to pursue ideas that might fail, that might lead nowhere. But most of all, it would require a shift in mindset, from defending established narratives to questioning them, from assuming we know the limits of ancient capability to accepting that we might not. This is difficult. Academia is conservative, cautious, and for good reasons. Wild speculation can damage reputations, waste resources, lead down paths that are dead ends. But conservatism can also become ossification, where the defense of established ideas becomes more important than the pursuit of truth. The balance is delicate, but in the case of ancient technology, of monuments that resist explanation, the balance has tilted too far toward conservatism. We need more willingness to experiment, to test unconventional ideas, to take seriously the possibility that the past is stranger than we think. Because if we do not, then the monuments will remain mysteries, and the knowledge they represent will remain lost. And that would be a tragedy, not just for our understanding of history, but for our understanding of what humans are capable of, what we might achieve if we are willing to look beyond the familiar, beyond the tools and techniques we have inherited, and consider that there are other ways, other paths, other methods that we have yet to rediscover. Look around you at the world we have built, at the technology we rely on. Much of it would seem like magic to someone from a century ago. Flight, computers, instantaneous global communication. We have achieved these things through science, through the systematic exploration of natural laws, through building on the accumulated knowledge of generations. But what if there are natural laws we have not yet explored, principles of acoustics, of material science, of biology that we are only beginning to touch? And what if ancient peoples, lacking our distractions, lacking the rapid pace of change that characterizes modern life, had the time and the focus to explore those principles deeply, to refine them over centuries, to achieve results that we find impossible because we have not walked that path? This is not an argument that ancient peoples were more advanced than we are, not in the sense of having computers or spacecraft. It is an argument that advancement is not singular, that there are many ways to be advanced, many forms of knowledge, and that some forms might leave little physical trace, might be encoded in practice and oral tradition rather than in texts and artifacts. And if such knowledge existed and was lost, then the monuments are the evidence, the proof that something once was, even if we cannot fully explain what that something was. The question that haunts all of this is, why? Why, if ancient peoples had techniques for shaping stone without tools, for moving massive blocks with ease, for achieving precision that we struggle to match, why are those techniques not written down? Why do we have no manuals, no technical drawings, no explicit instructions? The answer might be that such knowledge was not meant to be written. In many traditional societies, the most important knowledge is not recorded in text but transmitted orally, from master to student, through demonstration and practice. This is how craft knowledge works, how art is taught, how skills that require not just intellectual understanding but physical mastery are passed down. You cannot learn to be a blacksmith by reading a book. You must work the forge, feel the metal, understand through your hands and your eyes when the iron is ready to shape. The same is true for stone working, for any craft that requires intimate knowledge of materials. If the techniques for toolless stoneworking were of this nature, requiring not just knowledge but skill, sensitivity to the material, a feel for the process that only comes with years of practice, then writing them down would have been difficult, perhaps impossible. How do you describe in words the exact frequency at which stone begins to resonate, the precise pressure to apply when the stone is soft, the timing of each step in a chemical process that depends on temperature and humidity and the specific composition of the stone? You could write general guidelines, but the real knowledge would be in the doing, in the apprenticeship, in the years spent learning under someone who already knows. And if that transmission was interrupted, if the masters died without students, if the social structures that supported the craft collapsed, then the knowledge would die with them. Later generations might find the tools, if there were tools, and not understand how to use them. Or they might find no tools at all because the tools were organic, perishable, or were not tools in the conventional sense but techniques, knowledge held in the mind and the body. This is not unprecedented. We have lost knowledge in exactly this way throughout history. The Greek fire of Byzantium was a closely guarded secret, known only to a few, and when the empire fell, the formula was lost. The technique for making Stradivarius violins, instruments of unmatched acoustic quality, died with the makers, and despite centuries of analysis, we still cannot definitively explain what makes them superior or replicate them exactly. The ability to navigate the Pacific using only the stars, the waves, the birds, knowledge held by Polynesian wayfinders, was nearly lost and has only recently been revived through efforts to record and teach the old methods before the last of the traditional navigators passed away. These are examples from within recorded history, from cultures with writing. The loss of preliterate knowledge is nearly total. We have artifacts, we have ruins, but we do not have the context, the process, the understanding that animated those artifacts. We are like archaeologists from the far future finding a smartphone, able to describe its physical properties, to measure its dimensions, to analyze its materials, but unable to explain what it was for or how it was used, because all the supporting infrastructure, the networks, the software, the cultural context is gone. The monuments of ancient stonework are our smartphones, objects that persist after the infrastructure has vanished, and we are left to reverse engineer their purpose and their creation from the physical evidence alone. It is a difficult task, made more difficult by our assumptions, by our tendency to project our own methods onto the past, to assume that because we would use tools, they must have used tools, because we would apply force, they must have applied force. But what if they worked differently? What if their approach to engineering was not mechanical but something else, chemical, biological, acoustic, something rooted in a deep understanding of material science that took a different path than ours? then our attempts to explain their monuments using our framework would always fall short, would always require us to stretch credibility, to invoke patience and labor on a scale that strains belief, because we are trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The solution is not to abandon rigor, not to accept every wild theory that comes along, but to expand our framework, to test new hypotheses, to be willing to consider that the ancient world might surprise us. This is the essence of scientific inquiry, not the defense of established ideas, but the willingness to question them, to follow evidence even when it leads into uncomfortable territory. And the evidence is uncomfortable. It tells us that people who supposedly had only copper and stone tools achieved precision that we associate with machine manufacturing. It tells us that stones weighing hundreds of tons were moved and placed with a delicacy that modern cranes struggle to match. It tells us that surfaces were shaped without the tool marks that should be there if the shaping was done the way we think it was done. And it tells us, through the myths and the monuments, that knowledge has been lost, that the past is not fully known, that history is not the simple story of progress we like to tell ourselves. This is unsettling, yes. It challenges our sense of place in the timeline of human achievement. But it is also exhilarating, because it means there is still mystery in the world, still questions to be answered, still knowledge to be recovered. The monuments stand as invitations, as challenges, as reminders that we do not know everything, that the past has secrets, and that those secrets might hold keys to understanding not just how ancient peoples built, but how we might build in the future, if we are willing to learn from them. Consider the possibility that the mechanism of tool-less construction, whatever it was, might still exist in nature, waiting to be rediscovered. If ancient peoples used plant-based compounds to soften stone, those plants might still grow, unrecognized, their properties unknown because we are not looking for them. If they used acoustic resonance, the principles remain, encoded in the physics of sound and matter, waiting for someone to test the right frequencies at the right amplitudes. If they used biological agents, bacteria or fungi that interact with stone in specific ways, those organisms might still exist in the environment, their capabilities unexplored because we have not thought to look. This is the frontier, the edge where speculation meets investigation. And there are researchers working in these areas quietly, often without institutional support, testing ideas that fall outside the mainstream. Some of their work is dismissed as pseudoscience, and some of it probably is poorly designed experiments, wishful thinking, confirmation bias. But some of it might be legitimate, might be the beginning of a rediscovery, and we will not know unless we are willing to engage with it seriously, to test it rigorously, to separate the real from the imagined. There is a phenomenon in science called multiple discovery, where the same idea or invention appears in different places at roughly the same time, independently. The calculus was developed by Newton and Leibniz separately. The theory of evolution by natural selection was proposed by Darwin and Wallace independently. This happens because certain ideas are, in a sense, waiting to be discovered, latent in the accumulated knowledge of the time, and when the right conditions are met, when enough pieces of the puzzle are in place, multiple people see the pattern and arrive at the same conclusion. If techniques for tool-less construction are rediscovered, it will probably happen this way. Not as a single breakthrough, but as a convergence of insights from different fields, from acoustics and materials science and chemistry and biology, coming together to reveal a process that was once known and then lost. It might not be exactly the same process the ancients used, it might be a modern equivalent using our technology to achieve similar results, but the principle will be the same, and once it is understood, the mystery of the monuments will resolve, not into impossibility but into possibility, into a method that makes sense, that is repeatable, that explains the evidence. Until that happens, we are left with questions. And that is not a bad place to be. Questions drive inquiry. Questions keep us humble. Questions remind us that knowledge is provisional, that what we think we know is always subject to revision when new evidence appears. The monuments are questions carved in stone, and they have been asking those questions for millennia, patiently waiting for us to develop the tools, the concepts, the willingness to answer them. What if there was a civilization that never used tools at all? Not in the sense of having no technology, but in the sense of having technology so different from ours that we do not recognize it as technology, that we look at the results and call them impossible because we cannot see the process. What if the tools were not hammers and chisels but knowledge, techniques, an understanding of matter that allowed direct manipulation without mechanical intermediaries? What if the tools were songs, chemicals, living organisms, forces that leave no trace except the perfect surfaces they create? This is not an answer. It is a reframing of the question, a way of looking at the problem that allows for possibilities we have not considered. It does not claim to know how it was done. It claims only that how it was done might be different from what we assume, and that the evidence, precision without tool marks, massive scale without mechanical remains, global myths of lost abilities, supports this claim more than it supports the conventional narrative of patience and primitive tools. The ancient builders, whoever they were, left us their work. They left us monuments that outlast empires, that survive earthquakes and wars and the erosion of millennia. They did not leave us explanations, or if they did, those explanations were written in a language we have forgotten, encoded in myths we no longer take seriously, embedded in the stones themselves in ways we have not learned to read. But the work remains, and it asks us to be better, to be smarter, to be more curious, to be willing to admit that we do not know, and to keep searching for the answers. Because the alternative is to accept that the past is closed, that what we do not know we can never know, that the monuments are simply anomalies, outliers, evidence of nothing except that ancient people were more patient than we can imagine. And that is not a satisfying answer. It is not an answer at all. It is a closing of the book before the story is finished, a decision to stop asking questions because the questions are uncomfortable. But discomfort is where learning happens. Discomfort is the signal that we are at the edge of our understanding, that there is something beyond what we know, something waiting to be discovered. The monuments make us uncomfortable because they challenge our narratives, because they do not fit, because they suggest that history is not what we think it is. And that discomfort is valuable. It is the engine of progress, the force that drives us to look deeper, to question harder, to refuse to accept easy answers when the evidence demands more. So we return to the question, what if there was a civilization that never used tools at all? Not because they were primitive, but because they had moved beyond tools, had developed techniques that worked with stone at a level we are only beginning to understand? What if the monuments are not evidence of endless labor and patience, but evidence of knowledge, of skill, of a mastery of material science that we have yet to recover? And what if, in our search for that knowledge, we might rediscover something valuable, something that could change how we build, how we think about materials, how we understand the relationship between human ingenuity and the physical world? These are the questions the stones ask, and they are waiting patiently for us to answer. There is a story from the early days of archaeology, when the great monuments of Egypt and Mesopotamia were first being excavated, first being measured and catalogued by European scholars. The prevailing attitude was one of surprise, even disbelief, that primitive peoples could have achieved such feats. This attitude was rooted in cultural arrogance, in the assumption that advanced civilization was a European invention, that everyone else was merely waiting in the darkness until the light of Western knowledge reached them. We have rightly moved past this arrogance. We recognize now that intelligence, creativity, and capability are universal human traits, that every culture, every people has contributions to make, has knowledge worth preserving. But in rejecting the arrogance, we may have overcorrected. We may have become so eager to prove that ancient peoples could achieve great things with limited resources that we have stopped asking whether the resources were actually as limited as we assume. We have stopped considering that they might have had technologies, methods, knowledge that we do not have, that we have lost or never developed. This is not arrogance, it is humility. It is the recognition that human history is long, that many paths have been walked, and that some of those paths led to places we have not been. The monuments stand as evidence of this. They are not just impressive constructions. They are anomalies, data points that do not fit the models, and in science, anomalies are the most interesting data because they tell us where our models are wrong, where our understanding is incomplete. The precision of Pumapunku is an anomaly. The trilithon of Baalbek is an anomaly. The boxes of the Serapeum are anomalies. And when we have multiple anomalies pointing in the same direction, toward capabilities that exceed what we think is possible with known tools and methods, then we must consider that our assumptions about those tools and methods might be incorrect. This is not an easy consideration. It requires admitting uncertainty, admitting that we might be wrong, that the narratives we have constructed might need to be revised. It requires opening ourselves to ideas that seem outlandish, that challenge the comfortable story we tell about human progress. But if we are not willing to do this, if we are not willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, then we are not practicing science. We are practicing dogma. The path forward is clear, even if the destination is not. We need more research, more experiments, more willingness to test unconventional hypotheses. We need to bring together experts from different fields to break down the silos that separate archaeology from engineering, from material science, from acoustics, from chemistry. We need to fund projects that might fail, that might lead nowhere, because the potential reward, understanding how the great monuments were built, recovering knowledge that was lost, is worth the risk. And we need to listen to the myths, not uncritically, not as literal truth, but as data, as distorted memories of real events, real techniques, real knowledge. The myths of softened stone, of singing stone, of stone that moves without being moved, these are persistent, global, and they share common themes. That persistence, that commonality, suggests that they are not pure invention but are rooted in something real, something observed, something that was once done and then lost. If we dismiss the myths out of hand, we close off a potential source of insight, a clue that might lead us to the answers we are seeking. This is not an argument for accepting every myth as fact. It is an argument for taking myths seriously as historical documents, as encoded information from cultures that did not have writing or whose writing has not survived. It is an argument for the value of oral tradition, for the recognition that knowledge can be transmitted across generations without text, and that when it is, it often takes the form of story, of metaphor, of mythic narrative that carries within it kernels of truth. The builders of the ancient monuments are gone. They left no explanations, no technical manuals, no blueprints. But they left the monuments themselves, and those monuments speak if we are willing to listen. They speak of capability, of knowledge, of a relationship with stone that was intimate, sophisticated, far beyond what we credit to ancient peoples. They speak of precision that requires not just skill but understanding, not just tools but technique, not just labor but mastery. And they speak of loss, of knowledge that was once held and then forgotten, of abilities that were once common and then became myths, stories told around fires about ancestors who could do things we can no longer do. This loss is not unique to the distant past. We are losing knowledge now in the modern world, as traditional crafts die out, as elders pass away without passing on their skills, as the pace of change accelerates and the focus shifts always to the new, the cutting edge, the next thing. We are building a world that is, in many ways, more fragile than the world of our ancestors, because our knowledge is specialized, compartmentalized, dependent on systems that require constant maintenance. If those systems fail, if the grid goes down, if the supply chains break, how much of what we know would survive? How much would be lost in a single generation? The ancient builders faced similar collapses, similar catastrophes, and when they did, knowledge was lost. But the monuments remained, stone enduring when flesh and memory could not, and they remain today, asking us to remember, asking us to be curious, asking us to consider that the past holds lessons we have not yet learned. We are, all of us, inheritors of a long human story, a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years, through ice ages and warm periods, through the rise and fall of countless cultures, through innovations and disasters and moments of brilliance that changed the course of history. We are accustomed to thinking of that story as one of steady progress, of moving from crude to refined, from simple to complex. But the monuments suggest a different story, a more complicated one, where progress is not linear, where knowledge is gained and lost and gained again, where the arc of history is not an arrow but a spiral, circling back on itself, revisiting old questions, rediscovering old answers. If this is true, if history is cyclical, if knowledge is not cumulative but contingent, dependent on the survival of cultures and the transmission of skills, then the task before us is not just to understand the past but to preserve the present, to ensure that what we know is not lost, that the hard-won insights of modern science are recorded, distributed, made robust against the possibility of collapse. And part of that task is to recover what was lost before, to learn from the past, to extract whatever knowledge we can from the monuments and the myths, and to integrate that knowledge into our own understanding. This is not about returning to the past. It is not about rejecting modern technology or romanticizing ancient cultures. It is about completeness, about having the fullest possible understanding of what humans are capable of of all the paths that can be walked, all the methods that can be employed. If ancient peoples had techniques for shaping stone that we do not have, then those techniques are part of the human toolkit, part of our heritage, and recovering them would enrich us, would give us options we do not currently possess. Imagine a future where stone construction does not require massive machinery, where buildings can be shaped directly from bedrock using methods that leave no environmental footprint, that require no energy beyond human effort and knowledge. Imagine being able to repair ancient monuments not by replacing stones with modern replicas, but by using the same techniques that created the originals, preserving them authentically. Imagine the architectural possibilities if stone could be shaped as easily as clay, if massive blocks could be moved without cranes, if precision could be achieved without machines. This is not fantasy. It is the logical outcome of recovering lost knowledge, of taking seriously the evidence that such knowledge once existed. The path to this future is uncertain. It requires research that might not succeed, funding that is difficult to secure, a willingness to challenge established narratives and risk professional reputation. But it is a path worth walking because the potential rewards are immense, and because the questions themselves are valuable regardless of whether we find answers. The process of asking, of investigating, of testing hypotheses and learning from failures, this is how knowledge advances, how understanding deepens, how we move from ignorance to insight. And perhaps, in the process, we will gain something more than technical knowledge. Perhaps we will gain humility, a recognition that we are not the pinnacle of human achievement, that we stand on the shoulders not just of giants but of entire civilizations whose names we do not know, whose contributions we have forgotten, whose monuments are the only testament to their existence. Perhaps we will gain perspective, a sense of our place in a long timeline, a realization that what we build today will be judged by future generations just as we judge the works of the past. And perhaps we will gain wisdom, the understanding that knowledge is fragile, that it must be preserved and transmitted, that each generation has a responsibility to the next to pass on not just technology but the underlying principles, the understanding that animates the technology and makes it meaningful. The monuments of the ancient world are not just relics. They are libraries, archives of knowledge encoded in stone, waiting to be read. The language of those archives is not written in words but in precision, in technique, in the physical properties of the structures themselves. Learning to read that language is the challenge before us, and it is a challenge that will require patience, creativity, and a willingness to think beyond the constraints of current paradigms. There is a concept in philosophy called the hermeneutic circle, the idea that to understand the whole, you must understand the parts, but to understand the parts, you must have some sense of the whole. This is the problem we face with ancient stonework. We look at individual stones, individual sites, individual techniques, but we cannot fully understand them without a framework, a theory of how they were made. But we cannot develop that framework without understanding the details. We are caught in a circle, and the only way out is to iterate, to move back and forth between detail and theory, refining each in light of the other, slowly converging on an understanding that fits the evidence. This process is slow. It is frustrating. It requires accepting ambiguity, living with uncertainty, resisting the temptation to settle for easy answers. But it is the process by which real understanding is achieved, and it is the process we must commit to if we are serious about solving the mysteries of ancient construction. The stones are patient. They have waited thousands of years for us to ask the right questions, to develop the tools and concepts necessary to understand them. They can wait longer, but we, with our brief lives, with our fragile memories, with our tendency to forget and repeat the mistakes of the past, we cannot afford to wait. We must act now while we still have the resources, the stability, the luxury of pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Because if we do not, if we allow these questions to remain unanswered, if we let the monuments stand as mute enigmas, then we are failing not just as scientists, not just as historians, but as inheritors of a human legacy that stretches back to the dawn of our species. We are, all of us, connected to those ancient builders, connected by the continuity of human experience, by the shared challenges of existence on this planet, by the common quest to shape the world around us, to leave something behind that will outlast our brief lives. They succeeded in that quest. Their monuments stand, testaments to their skill, their knowledge, their determination. And they challenge us, across the millennia, to rise to their level, to understand what they understood, to achieve what they achieved, and perhaps, if we are fortunate, to surpass them, to build on their foundation and reach heights they could not imagine. But we cannot surpass what we do not understand. We cannot build on a foundation we have not examined. And so the work must continue, the questions must be asked, the stones must be studied, the myths must be read, and the experiments must be conducted. The path is long, and the destination is uncertain, but the journey itself is worth taking, because every step brings us closer to understanding who we are, where we come from, and what we are capable of. Let us turn, finally, to the implications of all this, to what it means if the thesis we have been exploring is true. If ancient civilizations had techniques for shaping stone without conventional tools, if they could soften or vibrate or chemically alter the material in ways we have not rediscovered, then the timeline of human technology is more complex than we thought. It is not a simple progression from primitive to advanced, but a landscape with multiple peaks, where different cultures at different times reached heights of achievement that were then lost, forgotten, replaced by other approaches. This has profound implications for how we think about progress, about civilization, about the relationship between knowledge and survival. It suggests that technological advancement is not inevitable, that it can be reversed, that what is gained in one era can be lost in the next. It suggests that the collapse of civilizations is not just a political or economic event but an epistemic one, a loss of knowledge that can set humanity back centuries or millennia. And it suggests that we, in the modern world, with all our technology, with all our science, are not immune to this process, that if our civilization were to collapse, much of what we know would be lost, and future archaeologists would look at our ruins and wonder how we achieved what we achieved. This is a sobering thought, but it is also a motivating one. It tells us that preservation of knowledge is not automatic, that it requires effort, intention, redundancy. It tells us that knowledge must be recorded not just in digital formats that require power and infrastructure but in durable media, in books, in stone, in forms that can survive disaster. And it tells us that knowledge must be distributed, taught widely, made accessible, so that it is not held by a small group of specialists who might all perish in a catastrophe. The ancient builders, if they had toolless construction techniques, might have failed in this regard. They might have kept the knowledge too closely guarded, transmitted it only to initiates, and when the social structures that supported that transmission collapsed, the knowledge died with them. We can learn from this. We can choose to make our knowledge open, to teach it broadly, to ensure that it is recorded in multiple places and multiple forms, so that it survives even if we do not. But we can also learn from their successes. They built monuments that have lasted thousands of years, that still stand despite earthquakes and erosion and the passage of time. They achieved precision that we struggle to match. They worked with materials in ways that suggest a deep understanding, a relationship with stone that was not adversarial but collaborative, not about imposing force but about understanding and guiding. There is a lesson here about craftsmanship, about mastery, about the value of deep knowledge of materials and processes. In our modern world, we often prioritize speed, efficiency, scalability. We build with materials that are cheap and quick to work with but that do not last, that require constant maintenance, that degrade within decades. The ancient builders made different choices. They built for permanence, for precision, for legacy. And their work endures. Is there a middle path, a way to combine the best of both approaches? Can we build with the speed and efficiency of modern methods but with the durability and precision of ancient techniques? This is a question for engineers, for architects, for materials scientists. But it is also a question for archaeologists, for historians, for anyone interested in understanding what the past can teach us about the future. The monuments are not just historical artifacts. They are data. They are experiments conducted by ancient engineers, tests of materials and methods whose results have been preserved for us to study. Every precisely fitted stone, every smooth surface, every massive block moved into place is a result, an outcome of a process. And if we can reverse engineer that process, if we can understand what produced those results, then we gain not just historical knowledge but practical knowledge, techniques that we might use, principles that we might apply. This is the promise of taking ancient technology seriously, of treating the monuments not as relics to be preserved in museums but as working examples, as blueprints, as lessons. It requires a shift in perspective, from seeing the past as inferior to seeing it as different, From assuming we have nothing to learn to accepting that we have much to learn, from viewing ancient peoples as primitive to recognizing them as peers, as fellow problem solvers working with different constraints and arriving at different solutions. This shift is happening slowly in archaeology, in anthropology, in the study of ancient cultures. There is a growing recognition that indigenous knowledge, traditional practices, oral histories contain valuable information that Western science has overlooked or dismissed. There is a growing willingness to collaborate, to listen, to integrate different ways of knowing. And there is a growing understanding that the past is not a fixed, settled domain but an active field of inquiry, where new discoveries are still being made, where the story is still being written. The question of tool-less construction is part of this larger conversation. It is a specific mystery, a particular puzzle, but it connects to broader themes about knowledge and loss, about progress and preservation, about what it means to be human and to create. And in asking this question, in pursuing this mystery, we are participating in a tradition that goes back to the ancient builders themselves, the tradition of inquiry, of experimentation, of pushing the boundaries of what is possible. They asked, how can we shape stone to match our vision? And they found answers that worked, that produced monuments of incredible precision and durability. We ask, how did they do it? And we are searching for answers using the tools of modern science, the methods of rigorous inquiry, the accumulated knowledge of our own civilization. The questions are different, but they are connected, part of a single ongoing human project, the project of understanding and shaping the world around us. In the end, the question of whether there was a civilization that never used tools at all is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. It is about what we choose to value, what we choose to preserve, what we choose to learn. It is about recognizing that human knowledge is vast and varied, that there are many paths to mastery, and that some of those paths might be closed to us now but could be reopened if we are willing to look, to question, to explore. The stones themselves cannot speak, not in words. They cannot tell us the names of the builders, the dates of construction, the methods employed. But they communicate nonetheless, through their precision, their mass, their endurance. They are messages from the past, written in a language of geometry and material science, and learning to read that language is the task we have set ourselves. Every measurement we take, every sample we analyze, every hypothesis we test is an attempt to decode that message. Sometimes the data is clear, sometimes it is ambiguous, sometimes it contradicts our expectations and forces us to reconsider our assumptions. This is the nature of inquiry, of the scientific process, and it is why the question of tool-less construction remains open, unresolved, a mystery that continues to draw researchers and enthusiasts, skeptics and believers, all trying in their own ways to understand. There is a beauty in this, in the pursuit itself, in the willingness to engage with questions that have no easy answers. It speaks to something fundamental in human nature, the drive to understand, to explain, to make sense of the world. And it connects us, across time, to the ancient builders, who were driven by similar impulses, who sought to create, to achieve, to leave something behind that would outlast their lives. We do not know their names. We do not know their stories. But we know their work, and through their work we know something of their minds, their capabilities, their aspirations. They were people like us, facing challenges, solving problems, making choices about how to invest their time and resources. And they chose to build monuments of incredible precision and scale, monuments that would stand as testaments to their existence, monuments that would challenge and inspire every generation that came after. In a sense, we are in conversation with them across the millennia. They posed a question with their stones. Can you understand how we did this? And we are answering, slowly, haltingly, with our measurements and our theories, our experiments and our speculations. It is a conversation that has been going on for centuries and will likely continue for centuries more, because the question is not simple, and the evidence is complex, and the stakes, understanding a fundamental aspect of human technological history, are high. What would it mean to solve this mystery, to finally understand how the ancient monuments were built? It would mean closing a gap in our knowledge, filling in a blank space on the map of human history. It would mean validating or refuting theories that have been debated for generations. It would mean, perhaps, recovering techniques that could be useful, that could change how we approach construction, material science, engineering. But it would also mean something less tangible, something more profound. It would mean proving that persistence pays off, that questions can be answered, that the past, no matter how distant, is not entirely lost, that through careful study and rigorous inquiry, we can recover what was forgotten and understand what was once known. And if we do not solve it, if the mystery remains unsolved, what then? Then we live with uncertainty, with the humility of knowing that there are things we do not know and may never know. This is not failure. It is honesty. It is the recognition that knowledge is limited, that some questions are harder than others, that the past guards its secrets well. And it is an invitation to keep trying, to pass the question on to the next generation, to ensure that the conversation continues, that the search does not end, that the stones continue to be studied and questioned and wondered at. Because the value is not just in the answer. The value is also in the asking, in the process of inquiry, in the community of people who come together around a shared question, bringing different perspectives, different skills, different insights. The question of toolless construction has brought together archaeologists and engineers, materials scientists and acousticians, chemists and historians, all working on different aspects of the same puzzle. And in that collaboration, in that exchange of ideas, there is value, regardless of whether a definitive answer is found. This is the spirit in which we should approach the mysteries of the ancient world, not with arrogance, not with certainty, but with curiosity and humility, with a willingness to be surprised, to be wrong, to learn. The monuments are teachers, if we are willing to be students. They teach us about precision, about durability, about the possibilities of human ingenuity. They teach us that the past is not simple, that history is not a straight line, that there is more to the story than we have been told. And they teach us that some questions take time, that understanding is hard-won, that the pursuit of knowledge is a journey without a guaranteed destination. We are, all of us, travelers on that journey, walking a path that has been walked before, that will be walked again, that connects us to every curious mind that has ever looked at an ancient monument and wondered. How? That connection, that shared curiosity, is part of what makes us human. It is part of what drives us to explore, to build, to create, to leave our own marks on the world for future generations to wonder at. And so the question remains, hanging in the air like the dust of ages, settling slowly on the surfaces of stones that have seen empires rise and fall, that have stood witness to the full span of recorded history and beyond. What if there was a civilization that never used tools at all? What if they had another way, a method we have lost, a technique we have forgotten, a knowledge that is encoded in the monuments they left behind, waiting for us to decipher it? The answer is out there, perhaps, buried in the stones, hidden in the myths, waiting in the natural world for someone to rediscover it. Or perhaps the answer is that there is no single answer, that the methods were many, that different cultures in different times found different solutions, and that part of the mystery is the diversity of human ingenuity, the multiplicity of paths to the same goal. Either way, the journey continues. The stones stand, the questions endure, and we, inheritors of a long tradition of curiosity and inquiry, continue to ask, to search, to wonder, because in the end, the question is not just about the past. It is about who we are, what we are capable of, and what we might yet become if we are willing to learn from those who came before. There is a final thought to consider, a possibility that is both humbling and exhilarating. What if the techniques for toolless construction were not lost accidentally, through collapse or catastrophe, but were set aside deliberately? What if ancient peoples, at some point in their history, made a choice to abandon methods that worked, to adopt new approaches that were less precise, less efficient, but that fit better with changing social or economic conditions? This might sound counterintuitive. Why would anyone abandon a superior technique? But it happens. Technologies are not adopted or retained purely on the basis of efficiency or effectiveness. They are embedded in social systems, in economies, in power structures. A technique that requires specialized knowledge, that can only be performed by a small group of trained experts, might be abandoned if that social structure collapses, if the guilds or priesthoods that held the knowledge lose their power or their legitimacy. A technique that requires rare materials or specific environmental conditions might be abandoned if those materials become unavailable, if trade routes are disrupted, if climate changes and the necessary plants or minerals no longer grow or can be found. In such scenarios, the knowledge does not vanish immediately. It lingers for a generation or two, held by older practitioners, taught to fewer and fewer students, until finally the last person who knows dies, and the technique is lost. Future generations, looking at the old monuments, might marvel at them, might attempt to replicate them using the tools and methods available to them, and might fail to match the originals, and might attribute that failure to the greatness of the ancestors, to lost magic or divine intervention, rather than to lost technique. This pattern is visible in history. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe were built using techniques that were, in many cases, not written down, that existed in the minds and hands of master masons. When the social and economic conditions that supported cathedral building changed, when the guilds declined, when the focus of architectural effort shifted to palaces and civic buildings, the techniques faded. Later architects, attempting to restore or complete Gothic structures, had to rediscover principles that had once been common knowledge. Some of that knowledge was recovered through careful study of existing buildings, through experimentation, through trial and error. Some was lost forever. If something similar happened in the deep past with techniques for stoneworking, then the loss is not mysterious. It is the expected outcome of social and technological change. And the monuments, the remnants of a time when those techniques were still practiced, are valuable precisely because they preserve evidence of methods that were once employed and then set aside. This perspective shifts the question slightly. Instead of asking, how did they do it? We might also ask, why did they stop? What changed? What conditions supported the use of toolless techniques? And what conditions led to their abandonment? These are historical questions, social questions, perhaps unanswerable without written records, but they are worth considering because they remind us that technology is not just about capability but about choice, about what a society values, about what it invests its resources in. The monuments, seen in this light, are not just technical achievements. They are statements of value, declarations of what mattered to the people who built them. They chose to invest immense effort, perhaps over generations, in creating structures of incredible precision and durability. They chose to push the boundaries of what was possible with their techniques. And they chose to build in a way that would endure, that would outlast their civilization, that would speak to the future. These choices tell us something about who they were, about what they believed, about what they hoped for. And they challenge us to consider our own choices. What are we building? What will endure from our civilization? We have the capability to create structures of immense scale and complexity, but much of what we build is designed for short lifespans, for obsolescence, for replacement. We value efficiency and economy over durability. We build in materials that are cheap and easy to work but that degrade quickly, that require constant maintenance, that will not last. In 1,000 years, what will remain of our cities? What will future archaeologists find? And what will they think of us? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are important questions. They force us to consider not just what we can do but what we should do, not just what is efficient but what is enduring, not just what serves the present but what might serve the future. The ancient builders faced similar questions, and their answers, encoded in stone, suggest that they valued permanence, precision, legacy. We might learn from their values even as we try to understand their techniques. So we return one last time to the monuments themselves. They stand on every continent, in deserts and jungles, on mountains and plains, beside rivers and oceans. They are diverse in form and function, but they share common qualities: precision, scale, endurance, and mystery. They are the work of many peoples, many cultures, many generations. They are humanity's legacy, the physical evidence of our long history, our persistent drive to create, to shape the world, to leave something behind. And they are questions, carved in stone, asking us to understand, to remember, to consider what we have lost and what we might regain. They remind us that knowledge is fragile, that it must be preserved and transmitted, that each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before and has a responsibility to those who will come after. They remind us that the past is not dead, that it speaks to us if we listen, that it has lessons to teach if we are willing to learn. The question of toolless construction is one thread in a larger tapestry, a single mystery among many, but it is a significant thread because it touches on fundamental questions about human capability, about technological history, about the relationship between knowledge and survival. And pursuing that thread, pulling on it gently, carefully, might unravel other mysteries, might reveal patterns we have not seen, might lead to insights that change how we understand the past and how we approach the future. So here we are, at the end of this long contemplation, no closer to a definitive answer than when we began, but perhaps with a deeper appreciation for the questions, for the complexity, for the sheer wonder of what the ancient builders achieved. We have explored theories of acoustic resonance, of chemical softening, of biological agents, of techniques that leave no tool marks, no mechanical evidence, only the impossible precision of the results. We have considered myths and monuments, science and speculation, evidence and inference. And through it all, the central mystery remains. How did they do it? Maybe one day we will know. Maybe a researcher will make a breakthrough, will discover the chemical formula or the acoustic frequency or the biological agent. We'll test it and find that yes, stone can be softened, can be shaped without tools, can be moved without the massive mechanical efforts we have always assumed were necessary. And in that moment, the mystery will resolve, the question will be answered, and the ancient builders will be vindicated, their techniques recovered, their legacy secured. Or maybe we will never know. Maybe the knowledge is too lost, too fragmentary, too dependent on conditions that no longer exist. Maybe the techniques varied from place to place, from culture to culture, and there is no single answer, only a collection of local practices that produce similar results through different means. Maybe the evidence is not sufficient, the clues too subtle, the gap between their knowledge and ours too wide to bridge. Either way, the asking matters. The pursuit of the question, the willingness to challenge assumptions, to consider alternatives, to remain open to possibilities that seem unlikely or even impossible. This is the essence of inquiry, the core of what it means to seek knowledge. And in that seeking, we honor the ancient builders, we acknowledge their achievements, and we participate in the same human project that motivated them. The project of understanding the world, of shaping it, of leaving something behind that says, we were here, we mattered, we created. Look around you tonight, wherever you are in the world. If you are near any ancient stones, any old monuments, any structures that have stood for generations, go and visit them. Touch the stone. Feel its texture. Look at the joints, the surfaces, the places where stone meets stone. And ask yourself, how was this made? What did the builders know that I do not know? What techniques did they employ? What understanding did they have? What relationship with their materials allowed them to achieve what they achieved? And if you are not near any ancient stones, find a stone, any stone, and hold it. Feel its weight, its solidity, its coldness. And consider that this substance, this seemingly inert, unchanging material, is not as fixed as it seems. It is atoms held together by forces. It is chemical bonds, susceptible to disruption. It is a crystalline structure, capable of vibration. It is, in the right conditions, with the right knowledge, perhaps more malleable than we think. The ancient builders knew something about stone, something we have forgotten or never learned. And the monuments they left behind are invitations, challenges, reminders that human knowledge is vast and varied, that there are many paths to mastery, and that some of those paths might still be open, waiting for us to walk them, if we are willing to look beyond the familiar, beyond the conventional, beyond the limits we have set for ourselves. This is the message of the stones. This is the legacy of the ancient builders. And this is the journey we are all on, whether we realize it or not. The journey toward understanding, toward knowledge, toward a fuller appreciation of what it means to be human, to create, to wonder, to ask questions that might have no easy answers but that are worth asking nonetheless. So I leave you with the question, the same question we started with, the question that echoes through the corridors of time, whispered by stones that have stood for millennia, carved into the bedrock of human history. What if there was a civilization that never used tools at all? What if they had another way? What if we could find it? And what if, in finding it, we discovered not just a technique for shaping stone, but a deeper truth about ourselves, about our ancestors, about the boundless creativity and ingenuity of the human spirit, about the knowledge that was lost and might yet be regained, about the monuments that stand as testaments to our long history and our enduring quest to understand, to create, to endure? The stones are waiting. The question is open. The journey continues. And somewhere, In the deep past, in the time before memory, the ancient builders smile, knowing that they left us a mystery worthy of our best efforts, a challenge that will draw the curious and the courageous across generations, a message that says, "You do not know everything, you have not seen everything. There is more to the story than you think. Listen to the stones. They have been speaking all along." Thank you for listening tonight, for joining me on this journey into the mysterious, the unsettling, the profound. If this exploration resonated with you, if it stirred something in your mind, leave a like, subscribe for more deep dives into the history that sleeps between myth and evidence, and tell me, what monument near you has always felt impossible? What stone speaks to you? Until next time, rest well, and remember, the past is not dead. It is not even past. It is here, in the stones, waiting for us to understand.